Daniel chapter 11, verses 21 to 35. He will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. After coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people he will rise to power. When the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them and will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers did. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. He will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. With a large army, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army, but he will not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. The two kings, with their hearts bent on evil, will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time. The king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country. At the appointed time, he will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up an abomination that causes desolation. With flattery he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword, or be burned, or captured, or plundered. When they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. Some of the wise will stumble so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time.
Thank you, Chris. Back to you.
Thank you very much, and good to be back again. I'm going to share my screen now, and I've got a few PowerPoint slides there. Some of you may remember I spoke as part of the Daniel series earlier on a few weeks ago, and my topic then was one of the best known passages in the whole of the Old Testament, Daniel and the lion's den, one that we know really well. Today's is a lot more challenging, and I'm kind of guessing that most of us hardly ever read Daniel 11. If we come to it at all, it's possibly, we're following a program of going through the Bible a year, and we come to Daniel 11, and there's a lot in it about, the king of the south did this, the king of the north did that, and so on. And we read it, and then probably, if you're like me, move on none the wiser. But for all that, I think there's a great deal in Daniel 11 that's very rich and very relevant to today's circumstances. And definitely some challenges there. And let me talk about some of those. So the first question I'm going to pose for you is Daniel 11 a true prophecy, or was it written with the benefit of hindsight? And I want you to imagine a couple of things. First of all, imagine that you're in a second-hand bookshop one day, and you pick up an old book, and it's describing a kind of epidemic that swept the world. And so you buy the book and take it home and start reading it. And as you read this old book, you become struck by how accurately it appears to be describing the events that we're living through in 2020 and 2021. And almost a startling accuracy. And I think you'd be quite impressed by that, and you'd think, "Gosh, wow." But then again, I guess imagine that in say 50 years' time or 100 years' time, somebody writes a historical novel, and the novel is set in 2020 and 2021, and describes the pandemic from the perspective of somebody living through it. And I guess you might actually find that a very good book, but you probably wouldn't be impressed if the details seemed accurate, because after all, the author is writing with the benefit of hindsight. And one of the questions written about Daniel 11 is, which sort of book is it? Is it in a sense a book that was looking forward to events which had yet to happen, or is it an event looking back at things that had already happened? And let's try and kind of narrow that down and look at a few verses to see just what the challenge there is. So I'm going to just have a quick look at verses 3 and 4 of Daniel 11. Then a mighty king will rise to power, who will rule with great authority and accomplish everything he sets out to do. But the height of his power, his kingdom will be broken apart and divided into 4 parts. It will not be ruled by the king's descendants, nor will the kingdom hold the authority it once had, for his empire will be uprooted and given to others. Now, the experts are pretty much agreed that verses 3 and 4 are describing Alexander the Great. He was a king who achieved remarkable things. He died early, and his empire quickly broke up and was split not between his descendants, but between 3 of his generals. So verses 3 and 4 seem, pretty much to be describing the kind of rise and fall of Alexander the Great. And you might be thinking, so what? But the so what question is this. You see, Daniel is set in or around the year 539 BC, when the Medes and the Persians kind of conquered and took over Babylon. That's the setting for Daniel chapter 11. But at that time, in 539 BC, Alexander the Great is still 216 years in the future. Now, just let that sink in for a moment or two. Between October and December 2019, in this country, we had a general election campaign. And, over the weeks of the campaign, thousands of words were written and spoken, not only by the politicians who were taking part and vying for our votes, but also, experts and commentators of all descriptions had lots to say during October to December 2019. But, the one thing I don't remember ever being mentioned during the general election campaign of those weeks, and that was the coronavirus pandemic. And you might think, well, so why was it never mentioned? It was only a week or two away before that would be upon us. And of course, the reason it was never mentioned is that, with very few exceptions, really nobody saw it coming. So, human beings have a very limited ability to grasp what's going to happen next. But here is the book of Daniel seeming to predict, and not only in these verses, but in many of the verses that followed, with quite considerable accuracy, events that are still long in the future. Now, of course, those who write books and entries in Wikipedia, who are got little time for the supernatural, that presents something of a challenge. And they may answer that challenge by deciding that the book of Daniel must have been written after the events, writing backwards. So they would kind of date the book of Daniel to the death of the emperor that we're going to, the king that we're going to discuss later on, Antiochus Epiphanes, and say it's a historical novel effectively. But you know, other commentators, probably from a more conservative background, you know, are insisting and giving plenty of evidence that, you know, Daniel was written where it's placed in the 6th century BC. It's a fascinating question, and if you want to know more about it, then there's a very good commentary in the Bible Speaks Today series by Dale Ralph Davis on the book of Daniel. But I'm going to kind of move on from that now, because although I do think it's fascinating, I also think there's a sense in which, you know, Daniel still speaks today and describes many of the issues that we currently face. Because Daniel is giving us a kind of big picture view of history. Now, Daniel 11, verses 2 to 20, seems to describe a period of around 375 years, really from the time of the Medes and the Persians through to the death of King Antiochus Epiphanes. And, you know, when you read it, there's a great deal of kind of toing and froing. As I said, you know, at the beginning, there's a lot of, you know, the king of the south did this and the king of the north did that, and it kind of all goes on. And actually, that's pretty accurate to what was happening in history. After the death of Alexander the Great, his empire was broken up amongst his former generals. And out of that arose two separate, I suppose, mini empires, we would say. One is the Seleucid Empire, that was a kind of Greek-speaking, Greek-worshipping empire, but based in what's today Syria. And the other is another kind of Greek-speaking, Greek-worshipping empire, but based in Egypt, the Ptolemaic kingdom, and that's the kingdom of the south. And these two superpowers were vying with each other as to who could be top dog. And little Israel was kind of caught in the middle of that from time to time. But you know, as you read all of that, you know, there are many kind of headlines of this happening and then that happening, then the other happening. But you're sort of left wondering things. So what was the point? It all feels kind of circular. We seem to be going around the same bit again, and it all seems slightly pointless. And I think that is actually something that Daniel is saying to us. You know, some of that history of superpower rivalry, of kings doing this and kings doing that, and this happening and that happening, you know, there's an air of futility about kind of human power and privilege and all of that you can see. And you know, I think we kind of experience that in today. You know, if we think back history over recent decades, you know, we think of what has happened in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Syria. And you think, you know, all those lives lost, all those efforts, all those promises that things would be different as a result of this, and what has really been achieved, and what has really come out of all this. And I think, you know, one of the things that Daniel is kind of reinforcing is the idea that if we want to kind of really understand the big questions of life, if we want to have a big picture understanding of what's going on, you know, we're not going to find that in the headlines in our newspaper or on BBC News. That's not, in a sense, where the answer will be found, because there is a degree of pointlessness to all of that, of human futility. I found this actually, it was a very interesting quote, but I found it in a commentary on the book of Matthew, chapter 24. Chapter 24 of Matthew is in some ways a very similar passage to Daniel 11, but in the New Testament. In fact, it's the passage where Jesus actually quotes from Daniel chapter 11. And it says this: when the hope of life eternal is absent, the riddles of life and death, of guilt and grief go unsolved, with the frequent result that men succumb to despair. And I think that's absolutely spot on. Those words, and certainly were written in 1965, but how true they could be to our present situation when, you know, in a sense, you know, mental well-being in our country has never been more kind of wobbly than it is today. Is that without some kind of bigger picture understanding, then the riddles of life and death and of guilt and grief do go unresolved. So we need that bigger picture. But I think there's something else in Daniel 11. That is, you know, although in a sense the first theme seems to be, you know, the kings and all that they do. And actually, in Daniel 11, God is hardly mentioned in what's quite a long chapter. Nevertheless, there is a kind of sub-theme that we can pick up as we read it. It comes out, you know, more than once. In fact, it comes out repeatedly in the reading. And I'll just, you know, I picked out just a few extracts to illustrate the point. The king of the south will be filled with pride and will execute many thousands of his enemies, but his success will be short-lived. He will make plans, but his plan will fail. It will make no difference because the end will come at the appointed time. At the appointed time, he will invade the king of the south again. The king will do as he pleases. He will succeed, but only until the time of wrath is completed. For what has been determined will surely take place. His time will suddenly run out and no one will help him. So you get the sense that, you know, behind all this kind of messy human history of, you know, pagan empires doing this and then doing that and fighting with each other and vying just who can be the top dog, that somehow, you know, God is his own kind of timetable that's imposed on that and can call time on those emperors. And he is, you know, ultimately, to use a different expression, that God is on the throne. And, you know, that's such a key truth. Let's not kind of misunderstand that, you know, in this passage, as in life as we see it, you know, some of the pagan kings, you know, ruled for a long time and were able to do as they pleased, and in some cases were persecuting the people of God for an extended period. So when we say that God is on the throne, it doesn't mean that he kind of sends his bills in every day. But it does mean that, you know, kind of finally, ultimately, God has the last word and he can call an end to things and can ultimately call even pagan emperors to give account to him. And that's a really important understanding that helps us, I think, make sense of the universe in which we live. I hope you kind of forgive me the next slide with its pictures. And I'm not putting up those two pictures that we're very familiar to of the departing and arriving Secretary of State for Health in order to go at either of them or to praise either of them. That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying that, you know, in a sense, the truths in Daniel are also applicable in our time also. That, you know, the rising and falling of politicians and of nations is every bit as much in the ultimate control of God today as it was in the time of Daniel and in the time of, you know, the Bible. God is still on the throne. God still has the final word. And the powerful, we think they control their own destiny, but ultimately they don't. And that's a key truth. And also because we do not control our own destiny either. The coin on your screen, I've got this picture from Wikipedia, is of King Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was one of the Seleucid emperors, so, you know, a Greek-speaking but based in Syria, and a significant king in the Seleucid Empire for a period from 175 to 164 BC. And the little inscription on the coin is in Greek, and it says, King Antiochus, God manifest, bearer of victory. And we're in no danger of false modesty with a title like that, is there? And Epiphanes actually meant God manifest. So here's a man who saw himself as, in a sense, as being a God figure. And Antiochus Epiphanes was responsible for some very ferocious persecution of the Jews. And again, you know, verses 21 to 35 do seem to describe in quite a lot of detail what we know from other sources Antiochus got up to. For example, at one point he did plan an invasion, invaded Egypt, and then the Romans, who were actually even more powerful than he was, kind of intervened and said to him, we're not having this, we're not having you extending your power into Egypt, you know, go back. And so he went back, but he went back and ferociously persecuted the Jews. In the book of Maccabees, the description having 3 days, 80,000 Jews were lost, 40,000 of them, men, women and children, murdered in just 3 days, and another 40,000 taken off into slavery. and he worked to really kind of exterminate Judaism. And sadly, he wasn't just doing that on his own. There were a kind of section of the Jewish population who sided with him. I suppose, you know, the Seleucids were the superpower, and the superpower had their gods, who were the Greek gods, and they felt as if they would be very powerful modern gods. And so a section of the Jews supported Antiochus, but another section obviously maintained loyalty to Yahweh. And he was responsible for terrible things. So it was a capital offense to have your son circumcised. It was a capital offense to own a portion of the scriptures. And he was a nasty piece of work. The abomination that causes desolation that's mentioned both here and a mention of some future reappearance of it in Matthew 25 was probably an altar to the god Zeus, the kind of leader of the Greek gods that Antiochus put up in the temple itself. So he was responsible for ferocious persecution until he died and the Jews rose up and were victorious. But, you know, and there's I'm just again picking up 2 verses out of the reading we had earlier. During these persecutions, little help will arise, and many who join them will not be sincere. And some of the wise will fall victim to persecution. In this way, they will be refined and cleansed and made pure until the time of the end, for the appointed time is still to come. In many ways, it struck me that this kind of description of persecution, because, you know, Antiochus is an antichrist figure, but one of many, and many would follow him in history and, you know, behave in the way that he's done. And, you know, we are, you're conscious of this, but we are living in a time of unparalleled persecution of Christians today. And maybe because it's not touching us so much, we're not as conscious of this. So I picked out again a few quotes. Well, this is from an article in the Times in 2014. Across the globe, in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, Christians are being bullied, arrested, jailed, expelled, and executed. Christianity is by most calculators the most persecuted religion of modern times. Yet Western politicians have been reluctant to speak out in support of Christians in peril. And, you know, I couldn't help saying the parallel between, you know, Daniel saying, during these persecutions, little help will arrive, and the Times saying in 2014, Western politicians have been reluctant to speak out. And again, you know, a couple more quotes before I move on. One is, this is from a report from the Foreign Secretary by the Bishop of Truro. It talked about, you know, the growth of persecution of religions across the world, not only Christianity. And, you know, again, in our news today, we know that Muslims are being persecuted in India and in China and in Thailand, in what was Myanmar. But nevertheless, it's the persecution of Christians is worse than of any other religions. And something that I just came on my screen this week saying, you know, a report by researchers from London School of Economics. So, you know, not writing from particularly a Christian perspective, but from kind of respective perspective, saying that Christians in India are living in constant fear of the threat of violence, harassment, rape, and discrimination. So, you know, persecution is a factor of our times as well. And all this, I think, you know, kind of leads us back to the big kind of existential question, really, because prophecy isn't given to us like the weather forecast. It isn't given to us as a way of information, just to tell you what to, you know, what's going to happen next. That's not the purpose primarily of prophecy. It's not there just to tell you what the future will hold. It may do that incidentally. That's not the primary aim. The primary aim is to warn us and to get us to make wise choices today because of what's at stake in the future. And in a sense, those destinies do come out in Daniel 11 and in, as I said, you know, a kind of almost similar passage in Matthew 24. That final verse in Daniel 11, quite chilling, but quite final, of one of these great kings. His time will suddenly run out and no one will help him. And of course, you know, that's the epitaph of everyone who pursues their own way and has no time for God. Their time will suddenly run out and no one will help But it's interesting that, you know, Jesus in doing Matthew 24, it's followed by a series of parables emphasizing the importance of making wise choices today, of being ready. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. And that's the key message for us today. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word that spoke in the time of Daniel, but still speaks to us today. We thank you for that, Lord. Lord, may we be wise, and may we take to heart and to mind and into our very hearts the logic of all this, Father. May we make wise choices. May we choose to follow Jesus, come what may. Thank you, Lord. Amen.